Bonjour tout le monde. My name is Adrienne Burns, and I'm the chair of the National Arts Centre Board of Trustees and part of the steering committee for the Canadian Arts Summit. And everyone is grateful to have you here today for the Invested Philanthropist. Looking around the room and seeing the faces I know, I can tell you you're all invested philanthropists. It's certainly something we know about in spades at the National Arts Centre and is ever present with all of us and every organization that's taking part in this summit. I'm here just to introduce your panelists and turn it over to your moderator, Nichole. So I'd like to start with Alexandra Bailey. Alexandra, if you just put your hand up for those who might not know you, is Managing Director of Good and Well, an investment firm that supports businesses with a social purpose. She's co-chair of the Canadian Stage Board, treasurer of the Art Canada Institute, and advisor to the Queen's Biological Field Station. Welcome to you, Alexandra. Next, I have Anne Maggisano. She's the Vice President of Client Relations at Burgundy Asset Management. That is not a wine company. Too bad. In 2014, she launched the Women of Burgundy to inspire women clients to make investing a priority. She also serves on the board of the Canadian Opera Company, the Toronto Public Library Foundation, and Crow's Theatre. So welcome to you, Anne.
Thank you.
Judy Matthews has leveraged her professional planning expertise to help realize quite a number of initiatives, including the revitalization of St. George Street, the Open Space Master Plan, University of Toronto, the Music Garden at Harbour Front Centre, and the Bentway, a civic endeavour to repurpose vacant space under Toronto's Gardiner Expressway. Judy has also taken leadership roles at Evergreen, Park People, Artscape, and the Canadian Opera Company. Welcome, Judy. After a thriving career in television in Los Angeles, Karlee Vukets came home to Toronto to become a financial advisor, primarily for professional women and philanthropic-minded individuals. She is the executive director of the Michael and Karen Vukets Family Foundation, the chair of the First Positions Patrons at Canada's National Ballet School, and a committee member of Art Scene Toronto through Business for the Arts. Karlee. And finally, someone known to most of you, Nicole Anderson, our moderator. She is president and CEO of Business for the Arts, which works to stimulate business volunteerism and investment in the arts. Nichole also holds a number of volunteer positions, including as a board member of the Arts Access Fund, which gives scholarships to children and youth from underserved communities to take lessons in arts discipline of their choice. Nichole, thank you for putting this together, and I turn it over to you and all of your panelists. Thank you.
So I'm supposed to steal this microphone. It's a pleasure to have all of you here. I know how busy you are. And I thought how fitting, we've just heard from Arthur Cohen's team at La Placa. And he said the number one reason why Canadians give to the arts is because of their social impact. That's what they look for. They look for their community impact as an arts organization. That's really the driving force. And when I think about each one of you and what you've done and what you're currently doing in terms of leaders in the philanthropic space, you certainly are having tremendous social impact. So I thought just to sort of kick things off, I've asked each of you, if you're involved in so many things, just talk about one of your coup de cœur right now in terms of what you're doing in the philanthropic space as an opener, and then we'll go from there. So beginning with Anne, just tell us a little bit about what you're doing now and what sort of drives you right now in terms of your philanthropy.
Well, I do want to start by saying I am part of 3 boards, and trying to pick one is almost like trying to pick your favorite child. So because you asked me to pick one, I'm going to mention an initiative that I'm working on with Crow's Theatre this year. And the initiative is to support the advancement of women in theatre space, and particularly at the higher levels, which are the levels of artistic director, and playwrights. I was surprised to learn over this past year that there is a gender imbalance in the theatre space at those levels, that 70% men and 30% women that tend to occupy those positions. And that's a data point that hasn't changed over the past 30 years and doesn't seem to be changing, even though when you look at graduates out of theatre programs, that most of the graduates are women. So I worked together with Crows to develop this sponsorship where we are supporting 2 female assistant artistic director positions at Crows Theatre this year. There's paid employment, which is very important. It provides an opportunity for mentorship from Chris Abraham, who's the artistic director of Crows. It's an opportunity to work directly on a main stage theatre production in a professional theatre company. And they will be able to put that experience on their resume, and that's going to help leverage them and help them get their next job. So why did I pick that one? It was mentioned in my introduction that I work in the investment industry, and I am a big advocate for supporting women and becoming more empowered around their investments. And from my work over the past 4 years in Women of Burgundy, I am hugely optimistic that if we have strong leadership around these issues, the change can happen. And in the past 4 years, we've impacted over 500 women in terms of bringing them to the table and helping them engage with their investments. So I think if there's strong leadership and a strong dedication to these sorts of issues, then we can make change happen.
I think that's fabulous. Building on that theme, so I met Alexandra Bailey at a Women in Art Patrons program that was just conceived by Michelle Kerner, who was going to try to be here as well at the AGO. And the whole mandate there is to encourage more female artists to be represented at the AGO, which Stefanos is really taking charge of. And so in that vein, maybe I should throw to you to talk about what other initiatives you're really involved with right now.
So I'm heavily involved with Canadian Stage right now. And as many of you know, it's a contemporary performing arts company based in Toronto. And we are going through a leadership transition right now. So it's a really interesting and exciting time in the company. And the next leaders will have a big impact on both the direction of the company and the social impact of the company. So from my perspective, it's quite an exciting time to engage in that.
Absolutely. And Karlee, very involved in lots of things, but what is your coup de cœur right now?
So one of my burning questions, one of my burning questions that I always try and answer, and that's on top of my mind right now, is how do you effectively engage young patrons in the arts? And how do we, with our volunteer time, money, resources, and expertise, amplify what the arts organizations are trying to do rather than drain resources and spending time with us or nurturing us to be future donors and supporters of the arts. So with Arts Scene Toronto, I got involved there, with Arts and Business Exchange as well, with Business for the Arts. And what we're really looking to do, and this is where I'm sneaking in my other initiative, where how do, with my volunteer time, hit both Art Scene and what we do with Nash Ballet School. So as chair of the Young Patrons Group of the Nash Ballet School, we did a partnership event with Art Scene Toronto, and it benefited both organizations and was quite a successful event. That one just happened last week. So with the initiative with Art Scene Toronto, it's how do we do that with all organizations and partner and break down those barriers and the silos that happens not only in the arts but the different sectors, and try and elevate what's going on already in the arts organizations.
That's terrific. And a bit later in the conversation, I'm going to ask you, how do you draw that generation to the table? Judy, what is your coup de cœur? I have a guess.
Well, I'm coming from a different space. My husband and I both strongly believe in being involved in the community and reaching beyond our personal domains and contributing to a wider world. And in this case, it's the city. And we very much believe in public space and arts and culture in public space. And we've also seen in this whole paradigm shift in cities now where everybody's moving into the downtown. And in Toronto particularly, we've got 250,000 people there, and it's doubling by 2040. And so there's all the housing and whole numbers of vertical communities, but none of the civic amenities. And the city is just overwhelmed. And so we feel, unlike many of the donors from that survey today, that if you can help your city, if you see a gap and you can help fill it, then you should. And so that's what we're doing. And we've come by this sort of trajectory because I've always had a deep interest in art and architecture and design. And when the 4 children went to school, I went back and got a master's at York University. And I always remember my first year reading Plato's Republic. And Plato said that serving one's city was a virtue of the highest value. So somehow that struck a chord in me, and is a strong motivator. So and then, as you said before, I've been involved with the Music Garden with Jim Fleck. I don't think he's here, but is he? Yeah. Under his tutelage and watched very carefully his modus operandi, which was very effective.
Has he told you about the Fleck flinch yet?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. That was all. That was 101.
101.
And also been involved in a number of other organizations like Artscape and Tim Jones and Evergreen Brickworks and the Opera, Park People. And so there was a history there of being involved. And so we were looking for a next step, sort of a bolder, bigger vision that was really going to create social change. Yeah.
So that's interesting, just picking up on that. This is my next question to you. So in general, what we see with philanthropy today is the more invested philanthropist, hence the name of the title. So no longer is philanthropy sort of, we'll give you a check and that's it. I actually asked Karlee a blunt question. Would there ever be a scenario where you would just donate to an organization and be done with it? And the answer is no. The proclivity is to get involved, to want to be involved. So the next leading question from there is, what is that drive? Where does that drive to lead come from in you? So, Anne, you are an exceptionally busy woman as VP of Burgundy Asset Management. Mm-hmm. You go out to events and then you go back to work. I've seen you do it.
That is
so
true.
You do. So why? What is it that drives you?
Yeah, I think it's just knowing that you can have a difference in the world and you can make a difference. And when you observe your reality around you and you see what's happening and you see how it could be better, there is a compulsion in me to use my skills, use my resources, use my education to make it better. And, you have that quote, I have a quote where change is inevitable, but progress is not. And we have to work really hard even to maintain the status quo, but to get to the next level and to make things better, we have to work even harder. And so I feel like I am motivated to do my best to make the world better.
But I think leadership is intrinsic. It really is a genetic characteristic you can see in kindergarten. So it's part.
You're born with it.
Yeah, you're born with it. And also, if you're doing something, especially in a big project, you have to be there to make sure, well, it doesn't matter what you're doing. You have to make sure that your vision is really going to happen. And so you have to be there. You have to keep people accountable, feet to the fire. And then in projects, they evolve and realities change, and you have to be at the table when there's changes and be part of that decision making.
And Alexandra, so this is an incredibly tough position you're in, to hire both the artistic director and the executive director of Canadian Stage, and you are managing director of this organization, Good and Well. Did you know, in taking the position of vice chair for Canadian Stage, that was going to be the job, for one thing, and as you look for that new leadership, with this lens of social impact and wanting to evoke that change, how does that play into the choice of that leadership for you?
Sure. I think I fell into the role a little bit more than sort of seeing it as where I was going. But I was very happy to, because I believe in the organization. And I think first and foremost, I have a very personal relationship with the art in the organization. So the art speaks to me viscerally, and it ignites my curiosity, and that's good for my well-being, and I want to share that experience with other people. I believe it's good for other people's well-being, and so it's important to me to do that. I also believe that the organization is really important for Toronto. I think we live in a world with a lot of structure, a lot of rules, a lot of assumptions, and it's important that we have places like Canadian Stage where boundaries are tested and questions are asked, assumptions are questioned. And so I believe that it's important for Toronto to have a center for contemporary performance. So that was also very important to me. I think another thing that goes back to the personal aspect is I'm really driven by the people. So inspired very much by Matthew and his vision, and Sherry and her vision, and the team. And if that wasn't there, I'm not sure if the other pieces would be strong enough for me. And then finally, I think the other thing is that there is a role that I know my skills can contribute to. And for me to engage in something, I have to know that there is a difference that I can make with my skill set. I don't want to be doing something where I feel redundant or not useful. So in this circumstance, I felt like there was a role for me to play.
That's interesting. Karlee has had similar things to say in terms of that desire to want to contribute. So not to be invited onto a committee to sell tickets to something. There's something more that, as whether you're a young professional or not, wanting to contribute something of value is really important. Would you say that's true?
I think that's exactly. You don't want to be redundant. You want your expertise to add value to the organization. The three resources I always talk about is time, money, and expertise. And the expertise is interesting to separate out from time, because you can be giving your time, but if you're not giving your expertise, you might just feel like, well, why am I using this hour of my time on this board rather than either at work or with family or with another organization where I couldn't be moving the dial? So you really want to, I feel like, especially my generation, our generation, is starting to get to where are we moving the dial, and that's where we want to spend the time if we are going to volunteer outside of work and do those things. And yeah.
And I think too they talked about it this morning, which was very important, that when you are involved, there's a tremendous sense of belonging that's very fulfilling, and that's part of being a citizen in the city today.
So that's interesting. That picks up on another line of questioning. So one of the things that came out of the Culture Check study, the number one barrier, of course, that sort of created silence in the room, was this notion of it's not for someone like me. And when you look at the Bentway project, which has just been opened, I think that project has been able to make everyone feel like this is for them, that this is for me. Can you just do you feel that is true? Obviously, now that you've seen the Bentway unveiled and the participation rates, would you say that you see a more diverse audience? Do you feel that it's this blending of so-called high and low art that's drawing people into the Bentway? Is that the secret of the access piece that the Bentway provides?
Yes, I see it breaking all these barriers down that we've been talking about. First of all, it's outside. It's not in a fortress, an institution. It's free. It's for everybody. The people there are incredibly diverse. When the skating opened, you could just see that. And 15,000 people came in minus 25 degrees. So it was clear people are looking for a space to connect and gather, in particular down there with the communities all in families in very small spaces, high up in the air. Loneliness is a real problem. So having them come down, it's like their front yard or their backyard. So yes, I think we're able to do that more than the institutions are able to do it, because it's just so much more open and more social.
More social. And so that makes me think of the Crows theater model that you're involved with, in the sense that Crows literally implanted itself in the lobby of a condo tower, because these are our new vertical communities. So from speaking of the institution, I mean, many of our delegates are obviously from the institutional side. How do we make our institutions more accessible? How do we bring people in? So, Anne, you've done an incredible job as co-chair, I think, for 3 or 4 years of Opera Nation for the Canadian Opera Company, to bring in the Gen Xers, I guess, as thousands of them to support the company. So what has been the secret to make that cohort feel more included?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a number of things at play here. First of all, it all starts with the people. So bringing together a really diverse committee, an Opera Nation committee, was really important. You had people from finance, people from law, people from media, arts, fashion, really bringing a lot of different voices around the table to make sure that we were going to be able to attract a diverse audience within that generation was really very important as a starting point. And then, the second element is that it's social. And then we heard this morning that sort of people are craving social experiences that they can do with their friends, or that they can take their clients, or where they have the opportunity to engage and interact with people that they don't normally have that opportunity to engage with in their day-to-day practice. And the third element, which I also think is important, is that we create this unique experience where we match a young student who's an opera singer with a professional, well-known pop star. So Nelly Furtado was one star that we brought in each year, 1 year. And they do a mashup. So you see the operatic voice next to the popular music voice. And you really appreciate the degree of excellence that is in that operatic voice. Nelly Furtado is great, but when you sort of can see the range of an Amber Braid or somebody next to a Nelly Furtado, then you really understand how much work and how much effort and how much talent is in that voice. And it does bring it back to the central mission of opera, which is about embracing the power of the human voice to transform you as a person.
And Karlee, a lot of the work that you're doing is to try to get people involved in the arts who might not have otherwise been involved in the arts. So, in looking at people's ideal cultural experience, as we learned from Culture Check, it's social, it's lively, it's interactive. Would you say that rings true for you in terms of programming events that would attract the so-called millennials or Gen X?
Yeah, whenever we do an event, especially with Art Scene, because we've had the fortune of partnering with a couple different organizations recently, and a few that came to mind as examples. We did a partnership with the Gardner Museum for the Yoko Ono exhibit, where there was hammers and nails and string, and you got to go hammer nails into a wall, which was kind of fun. And there was a meditation seat. Yeah. So talk about those two experiences in one. And the feedback we got from that was, I loved how interactive it was. So then a couple weeks later, we did the partnership with the ballet school. And so we did a panel about breaking down barriers. And afterwards, I just went, we practice what we preach. Everybody take off your shoes and go in the studio. And I thought people would leave at that point because it was the end of the night. They had been there for a tour, almost an hour and a half at that point, and we were asking them to stay for another 20 minutes. And 40 people got up, took off their shoes, men and women, and hopped in the studio and learned part of our sharing dance routine. It was a cool moment because I was like, yes, they got it. But it goes to show that they're craving that artistic feel for stuff, and I think it's also because the millennials, I was on the cusp of it going out of school, but arts, and they crave the arts, especially if they are working professionals. They don't get it in their professional lives, so they're looking for it outside of, whether it's even paint nights they go to at restaurants, drinking wine. Those are sold out. Across the city, you look at the paint night schedule, there's 5 every night across the GTA.
So there's a common theme here. Would you say it's the informality of the events that is the attraction? That you can take off your shoes, you were going to paint and drink wine.
Yeah.
Is that one of the key ingredients?
Yeah, I don't think we need, there's a lot of young people going to great galas all over the city for anywhere from $100 a ticket to $200 a ticket, sometimes even less than that. And those are great, but we don't always need super high production events. Sometimes it can be, let's sit in a room and talk about a panel, and there's coffee and tea, and we hop in a studio after. It doesn't need to be these big production things.
So formal.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last line of questions I have are moved us towards the sort of social impact piece and how we can think about the social value or that value proposition of the arts. And then I'm going to open the floor to questions. I know that I have a hard stop. We have lots of time. We have lots of time. It's only 2 o'clock. I have a hard stop at 2:45. So what intrigues me about your line of work, Alexandra, is that you are an impact investor, I guess. And so you invest in companies that do good. And in that line of work, I imagine you need to track and measure the impact of those companies and to ensure that they are doing good. So what interests me is with that frame of mind, if you took that lens and addressed the arts, do you see a connection? Do you see an opportunity for the arts to do that better or more?
I do. Excuse me. So I do see an opportunity to frame the story more towards social impact and paint that picture. But if I think about measuring social impact, I do see it largely like we measure social impact for companies. But it strikes me that there are a couple of challenges that arts organizations often face, and it's not isolated to arts organizations because there are companies that we look at that face these challenges as well, depending on the social challenges that they're looking at. But one I would say is it seems as though the social impact is not always clearly defined in arts organizations, or it's very broad. Or you may have, there's the arts and culture objective of it, and then the social impact. And so if I took Canadian Stage, we have the arts and culture objective of being a home and incubator, exporter of the best contemporary live performance. At the same time, we have a social objective. We have multiple social objectives, but one of them might be to invoke self-reflection and catalyze conversations that lead to social change. Now that's first.
How do you measure that?
Yeah, first there are two key things there, and then two, how do you measure it? So if I look at an example of a company that we invest in, CoPower, which finances green energy, their objective is to reduce carbon. It's very clear, it's simple, and it's easy to measure. So in the case of the example I brought up with Canadian Stage or arts generally, how do you first of all, if the social impact is not your primary objective, how do you put the resources into it to measure effectively? And then two, you can measure the outputs. So we can measure, if I took our MFA program, we can measure how many students go through the Masters of Fine Arts, for example. We could measure the outcomes. So we can look at what careers those students go on to take. But in terms of measuring what is really the impact of that on driving social change, it's pretty difficult. It's long term, and how do we know that it was us, and how do we measure it? So it seems to me that some of those bigger, whether it's broadly driving social change, whether it's well-being, whether it's creating more open and tolerant societies, whether it's trying to invoke more empathy, whatever the objectives are, some of that broader work likely needs to be done by organizations and institutions and academics, maybe like Business for the Arts, to be doing those, gathering that research. And I know there is some research on already on arts education and the value of arts education. So you can leverage that, but also looking at what is the role of arts in creating spiky cities and in creating resilience in cities. And if we had some more of that information, it would be easier to paint the picture. I do think that while impact measurement is important and we need the data and the evidence to drive the storytelling is also really important. And if I asked any of the entrepreneurs I work with about the use of their impact measurement, they use the data for major investors and then bits of the data to inform the storytelling, but the consumers actually respond to the storytelling better. So that, in our case, for example, asking one of the, we had this program called Territorial Tales, where newcomer youth were asked to write about their experiences, write about home, about displacement, about migration. And the top ones were selected, and they were performed at Shakespeare on High Park. And so having one of them talk about their experience and what impact it had on them is, I think from a consumer perspective, is probably powerful enough. But the impact measurement is quite important from the donor perspective, the funder side.
The funder side. And we have a conversation later this afternoon at 3:30 with some of our corporate funders who are becoming much more strategic in terms of how they give specifically, what metrics they're looking for. But that's not a great moving story that will draw more people to us, in the sense that, we heard from the Culture Track study today that 47% of our culture goers in Canada give to the nonprofit sector, but only 5% give to arts and culture. And their main driver, again, to give is social impact. So that belief in cause, impact on community is supreme. And then when we asked, why don't you give to culture, they said, well, government takes care of everything. So that's one. You talk to Alexander Neve and he'll tell you, that's one misnomer that we need to obviously help. Maybe it's business fair to the sector in general. But the other is that the priorities for Canadians are around health, poverty, children. And so with this in mind, does it behoove the sector, does it behoove the arts sector then to tell our story through that lens, in terms of how the sense of belonging, the arts are an antithesis to loneliness, in the sense that people are going to the arts, they say, through the culture, because they feel a sense of belonging and community. So then should we then make the correlation between better health, better well-being, and frequenting the arts? And there have been studies to show this. what do you think needs to be done to compel more Canadians who are culture goers? These are culture goers saying they only give to the arts organization, 5% only give to arts organizations. So what do we do? I'm looking at Anne as our investor.
Well, I think it's an easy thing to create a story or a narrative to a philanthropist. If you give X dollars, then this will happen. And maybe that strategy works in those sectors that are getting the most money, right? Maybe if you give X dollars, then we will buy 100 hospital beds. That's very easy narrative for a philanthropist to wrap their head around. But I'm not sure, and I think probably we've sort of circled around it, I'm not sure that approach really is the right approach for the arts, and I don't think it's an approach that would win over the long term. In fact, I think if we took that approach in the arts, we might be doing ourselves a disservice in the fact that we focus on the short term, and we would undervalue the broader impact that the arts can have in our world, whether that be aesthetic impact, economic impact, social impact. There are many ways that the arts are impacting us, and it's not all quantifiable, right? There's a lot of ways that all of this impact is just in the experience itself and in the intrinsic value of the arts itself. And then I also think the third risk of moving in that direction, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't, but you have to be careful about measuring impact, is that you are then conditioning the next generation of philanthropists to look for that as being valuable. And you want to be careful about what you're conditioning philanthropists to believe in terms of where they see value. So if we're going to speak about conditioning philanthropists, it's part of it is about educating them about the arts more broadly. And in specific around the opera, I was interested to see that the opera was one of the least valued on that one, or least attended.
Less of a priority.
Less of a priority. It was one of the, along with the ballet and along with the symphony. And I think one of the things that has to change is our understanding of what opera is, right? If you think of a pyramid, and Alexandra uses this analogy, and I think it's really good. What you see on the main stage, the operatic production, is just the tip of the iceberg, right? Actually, opera in Canada, the Canadian Opera Company in Canada, is doing so much in terms of community engagement, whether it be through their professional development program. They have the ensemble circle where they're training artists. They have the orchestra academy where they're training orchestra members. They're in the schools because the schools no longer, or a lot of schools have cut their music education program. So the Canadian Opera Company is filling in that gap. And we're now talking about a redevelopment of 227 Front Street, which will make that a community hub for the east end of the city. So changing the idea of what opera is and making it a more holistic and broader understanding of an art form that is engaged and interacting with the community and sort of responsive to how the community is changing is one way I think that we can talk about it. And then if I can continue, I do think it's important when you're talking to philanthropists to sort of come back to values. And what are the common values that would bring a philanthropist to that organization? And for the Canadian Opera Company, there's the value of really mastery and excellence at the highest level. And that is extremely rare. And one of the things that we're seeing, and Judy can comment on this too because she's on the board with me, is we're seeing over the past 10 years, we're seeing international opera stars coming to Toronto for the very first time. And it's changing the audience. We are now demanding and wanting to see people of this caliber come to our city. And that makes us more similar to a city like New York, where audiences there are used to excellence and value excellence for itself and in its own right. And so I think if we can change the thinking of our minds as philanthropists and sort of value excellence as something being worthy of and sort of being worthy of being around, I think that's very important.
Yes, well, I certainly agree with what you're saying, and I think what the opera is doing, as you mentioned, out on Front Street, really bringing it down to the grassroots, bringing a cultural hub, bringing in the community, and not for the big $250 3-hour event, but all sorts of indie opera kind of things. That's the way to go, and you expand your network. And I'm just saying, with the Bentway, I think we're just turning things upside down. Like, we are starting conversations between recreation and art and culture. Like, you can go skating and there will be an exhibition right there, which was on our first opening we had an art exhibition. And we also had the little skate aids, the kids and adult shoes. Well, they were designed by Raw Designed, and they were sort of sculptures. And and then we're also inviting local artists. We're putting out a proposal call for local artists to come and occupy some of the space, be able to have a workshop, and the Bentway will mentor them. So we're just starting a whole different dialogue between art and public space. And it's going to bring in a whole network of people. And any of the big institutions that want to come down, come on down.
Oh, I think it's fabulous. It's less rarefied, making the arts less rarefied for everybody.
Yeah. So my take on should the arts be partnering or creating stories around the different sectors that people are more likely to give to. One of the things that brings up for me is our partnership with the ballet school. And I think, for those of you who don't know, a little funny story, I grew up dancing, but ballet was never my strong suit. I had to do it for the technique, the competition. I was a tapper, and other types of dance. But they kindly invited me for a tour about 5 years ago, and I went. Beautiful building. I used to do performances there growing up, so it was nostalgic for me. And then I sat down with Catherine Gregor and Mavis Staines, and they told me about their sharing dance. And at that time, it was just launching, really, their sharing dance initiative. It was in their early stages, but they had a Dancing for Parkinson's program, and my grandfather had just passed away from Parkinson's. Oh, that's the first time I've almost cried from that in a long time. And it opened my eyes, and it's immediately I was like, dance, this is a cause that I know I'm going to get behind. So when I moved back from LA, it was a natural fit for me to volunteer my time there and for me to champion that program. And for me, it was a gateway into the school. And now I can talk about the professional dance program, quite eloquently, that I wouldn't have been able to necessarily do if they didn't have this community program that brought me into the school's family and that kind of stuff. So it does provide a gateway into the arts organizations, where then you get an opportunity to learn about all of the artistic stuff they do and the artistic excellence. And there's nothing wrong with having that gateway for those who might not be, this isn't something for me, right? And I know quite often the cab driver, I know Mavis has said she's been in a cab, and when she talks about, I'm going to Sharing Dance Day, the cab driver's like, you do that stuff at the ballet? So it's funny when he said the cab driver test. And I think that just opens doors.
Right, so it's sort of having a broader portfolio of offerings. So you still have the artistic excellence as a core mandate, for example, of the opera company. We're training our prima ballerinas at the ballet school, but there is a community mindedness. There's that social license piece. That seems pretty critical right now from everything we're hearing, everything you heard this morning also. You would last, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think on the artistic excellence piece, I think it actually has a huge role to play in social impact. I think social impact is much stronger when there's artistic excellence. So, from my perspective, it's certainly not one or the other. I think they're very closely linked.
In terms of, because if you're not watching a powerful performance on stage,
Hamilton,
the effect will not exist.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, Hamilton is powerful because of the artistic excellence in it.
Yes, I agree wholeheartedly, because I think when you see somebody who is achieving whatever is their field at the highest level, you are drawn to that degree of excellence, and you are motivated within your own lives to also achieve better things and to push yourself forward.
So some of it may be how we're framing what social impact is. Because I think each of us have talked about why we've engaged in the arts, and it's all been what I would term social impact. It's all been a drive to make a difference in some way, and the reaction that we have to the experience of the art.
Yeah, perhaps social impact is something more broad and can be considered that way in our narrative. Last point, and then I will open it up to the floor for questions.
I think it's so important to continually ask. I feel like I'm that little kid who's always like, but why? But why? And when you look at values, it's finding that right fit between the organization, and not everybody will be a right fit, and that's okay too, but you want advocates out there for you, and so making sure that values match can be there, I think is super important, and keep asking the why, because me saying, I give to the ballet school for social impact is very different than my grandfather suffered from Parkinson's and passed away, and there's this program that they're supporting, and I want to help them spread that, right? It's a very different why, which as soon as you explain the why further, it makes more sense, right? And you find that fit a lot easier, rather than here's all the amazing stuff we do, the tip of the iceberg, all these amazing community programs, rather than why do you invest, why have you invested in other places, and what are we doing that might fit why you invest type thing.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions for our panelists? Yes.
We have a wonderful opportunity which is unique, which is that all of you are Toronto-based, as it happens. But my question is general, but if you could answer it from the Toronto perspective, I'd be very grateful. I'd like to talk about the geography of new philanthropy. It strikes me from listening to you today that an invested philanthropy depends to some extent upon proximity and seeing the results and being engaged with the results. And nobody's arguing that that's a bad thing. But at the same time, I would argue that in Canada, the concentration of opportunity for investment, the disposable income, if you like, is concentrating more and more in the very largest centres. At the same time, a city like Toronto, or a community like Toronto, is going way beyond its borders. Is Hamilton de facto in Toronto? Is Oshawa in Toronto? And that being the case, are you concentrating too much in a specific geographical area that is going against the trend of how people act in society and where the needs are?
That's a good question.
We're all thinking about it.
Yeah. Well, the Canadian Opera Company is a national organization, so while it's headquartered in Toronto, I think that when you look at the deeper levels of engagement of communities, like I talked about the community outreach programs that are going into the schools, I think they are traveling the country and making sure that they are reaching areas that would not necessarily be accessible for people that didn't live in Toronto.
We were talking about that, Anthony, just before lunch, about Luminato. Somebody asked, do they go out beyond the city, downtown? And Anthony, you said yes, that you've been out in Scarborough. Do you want to elaborate on that?
We took a show to Scarborough last year, and it was very interesting. Without any doubt, we reached people who wouldn't have come into downtown. And we also did the same show in downtown, and it was the experience and the feeling was a completely different one.
I think with Art Scene specifically, it's a nationwide initiative from Business for the Arts. They've got chapters, I think 8-9 cities right now. And one of the most thriving chapters is PEI. And some of the relationships that were formed actually last year at the Canadian Arts Summit. And it's interesting because one of the conversations now is how do you create these in somewhere like Toronto that has thriving young patrons groups at all of the big institutions and some of the smaller institutions as well. do we get a committee member from each of the institutions and put them all around a table and that's the committee? Or, and these are the questions we're trying to have, but does that model work in PEI where maybe there's not 10 young patrons groups at all the different organizations? So how do you create kind of those structures tailored to the different cities that aren't the big centers? So I don't know, if with young patrons as well, when you talk about the invested philanthropists, as we saw, even though millennials are really apt to giving, it's kind of all over. We're used to a lot of crowdsourcing and crowdfunding, right? We're the Kickstarter generation, Indiegogo. When we've also talked at great lengths at galas, what's the price point of raffle tickets? Well, it's a raffle. Will it kill the organization to sell it for 30 versus 100, but you sell 3 for 90, or not 90, but like 80? Then you sell 3, right? And do you still get the same price point? But it makes people feel like, I'll just buy 3 rather than 1 for 100, right? So, how do you do that and make the price point accessible for at least the younger generation?
Well, I think your point of geography, maybe there's such density in Toronto of opportunity that we're starting to implode because the artists can't afford to live here. So they're going to Oshawa and Hamilton. So it's maybe a natural evolution that it's spreading.
And maybe this is an area where technology can have a huge impact, right? We've seen that in New York. They started Saturday afternoon at the Met, which is broadcast on movie screens. And you're introducing and cultivating a new audience that doesn't live in New York City through that technology.
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah, I just had a related question. It struck me when you were mentioning about how important it was for the philanthropists to be engaged and to be a real active member of the organization or its group. And I'm wondering, those of us who work in remote parts of the country, in the north, in indigenous communities, how can we attract philanthropists and make sure they feel that they're part of it, that they're engaged when we're so far away from the city?
I've had lunch with you, right? She's building a art performing center in Equality with 3,000. How many people?
Our city is a capital city, and it's a whopping 7,500 people.
75. They're having an art center.
We are a territorial organization to support the performing arts in 26 Inuit communities in the Arctic. But so we're wondering, how do we get that?
Well, I think if you look at what Paul Desmarais III has been doing in Cape Dorset with the Kerouac Center, he has been championing in the Montreal circles, in Toronto, with the corporate community, the philanthropic community. He's raised almost $11 million to create a 10,000 square foot space up in Cape Dorset to ensure that those Cape Dorset artists have a proper place to do their work, because it was falling apart, and we know the important heritage of the printmaking institute, but it's becoming more of a community, also a community hub. So I think that and I'll pass it over to you, but I think in that particular case, it was the storytelling of what's going on. So you're not there, but this is what's happening, and having an ambassador on the ground to do that, because it will rally the troops. There are people who are ready to rally the troops.
I agree. I think it's either bringing people to come and talk about the work, to inspire the audience in the room to give, to have that personal interaction with the story, or creating opportunities for philanthropists to come and visit and have that engagement. There's a conservation area in Kenya that a number of philanthropists have visited, and there are huge networks all over the world raising money for this conservation area just because of one visit.
I think an important question, I found video conferences is a little bit better than phone calls in all of my engagement, but I think one of the key questions when you engage somebody new, we do it at our young patrons group, is to say, at the end of a year, at the end of 2 years, what do you want out of it as an organization and as the philanthropist or the volunteer because I don't think that question gets asked enough at the start. And so setting expectations in the first meeting and saying, being transparent, we are going to ask you to sell tickets, but we're also going to do this, right? And being clear and honest and transparent about those expectations makes everybody feel a little better. Okay, I'm going to be asked to sell gala tickets, but then we get to do this, right? Or, not be expected to do that the whole year. It just creates that more engagement, and then you start to learn things about people being like, oh, well, this is what you want out of it. How do we tailor that experience? With a young patrons group, it's how often do you meet? Well, we've actually had more success meeting every month, because then if you miss a month, you don't feel bad like you've disappeared for 6 months, right? So we meet in person every month, and if you can't make it, come to the next one, right? Versus the arts feeling like, well, I don't want to take up too much of their time or the organization, right? That might not actually be the case. They might want to get more involved. So have that dialogue and say, well, what do you want out of this? How much time and what kind of format do you want?
Right. Any other questions? Yes.
Excuse me. It strikes me that each of you are very active at the board level, bringing your own personal passions for social impact, etc., to the cause. And I just wonder if you have examples of best practices within boards to create the space for the individual voices of each board member to affect positive change overall for the mission of the organization. Because I often feel sometimes there's people just sitting there waiting to be able to bring ideas and their own passion forward.
Well, I think it all starts with the leadership, and that would be the chair of the board. I've been on some and had some board experiences where it really is a reporting board, where you come together and you sort of hear what's happened, and there isn't a lot of room for discussion and debate. I think it's the leader and the chair of the board's responsibility to use the resources available to him or her wisely, and that is a resource base of people that bring broad areas of expertise in lots of different areas, whether it's finance or law, right? And if they can set the tone where this is going to be a meeting where we're going to sort of discuss an idea and debate an idea, then you will tap into the best of all the people around that board table. So I do think it comes back to the chair of the board and the leader.
And I think size has a lot to do with it. You sit at these tables with 34 people, and it's very intimidating, and you don't really feel that you can express yourself. And you also don't feel that you even need to show up, because there's 33 other people that'll be there. So I think size does play a big role. And just trying to... We're just incubating a board for the Bentway. We've just got about 5 or 6 on it now, and we really only wanted 12, and now we're creeping up to 15. But for a startup, but the idea is to get a real mix of people and sort of a community of minds too. I mean, everybody's got to think differently, but it's important that everybody sort of feel together, like feel they're working for a common cause. Boards are tricky things to do well.
I think really listening to each board member's interests and trying to figure out what it is that they can contribute to effectively, because if they feel like I have a clear role here, then I think they're going to be much more engaged and much happier.
Yeah.
The question I always like to ask at the beginning of the meeting, especially like starting off a new year, a new cycle, especially when there's new members that have joined, what are you really good at that you can't tell from your job title, right? Because one of those things, like they've got such a diverse background typically, that you'll learn new stuff about them that you would never have known just by their job title. Or there's another question I always like, but setting that and setting a space for questions and then kind of going around to see, and same thing, that same question of at the end of 2 years or an end of this year, what do you want to get out of this? How would you like to contribute? Because it might surprise you, or they might have passions outside of their work that you wouldn't automatically be able to tell.
Yeah, there's often professionals that are engaged in the arts precisely to get away from their job. That just because they're a lawyer doesn't mean they want to just do the legal stuff. Yeah. So it is 2:45. I want to thank you very much for being here and for all that you do as volunteers for the sector. It's truly wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
So here I am to close everything up and tell you to go to, am I on here? Anyway, Broadcast Voice. The next session is 3:15. And, of course, it's engaging diverse audiences, which I think is a terribly important one. I'd like to thank you all, Judy and Karlee, Alexandra, engaged and dynamic women. And, Judy, I'm sorry we didn't get to show your slide, but throughout the process, I know we will. But tremendous work that